To paraphrase Mark Twain, those attempting to find consistency in my best of lists will be prosecuted. Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today I thought I would take on a challenge. I saw Greg over at the channel Supposedly Fun do, and that was where he listed his top 25 books of the last 25 years. You know, I love a list, I love making lists, I love thinking about making lists, so I thought I would make this list. Now that means I'm going to talk about 25 books, which means I have to go really fast. This is not intended to be an in-depth discussion of any of these books individually, nor do I make any promises that books I might have listed as my top 10, even as recently, maybe as a few months ago, will actually make this list. Each one of the books on this list at some point, in some way, spoke to me, taught me something, contains lines, images, passages, ideas that I still think about today. Now, according to Greg, these books have been published from 1998 to present. I'm not going to get into the math or try to figure out if that's actually 25 years or not. I'm going with this setup, and so here we go. Oh, also, these books are not ranked in the order of greatest to least great. Okay, so the first book on my list is Paradise by Toni Morrison. This is, I think, Morrison's least decipherable book. But I do think it deserves to be on the list, A, because Toni Morrison should always be on a list of greatest books. Anytime you can put a book of hers there, you can. This is about, this novel is set in the 20th century in an all-black community that was founded after slavery came to an end by a group of black men who were escaping Jim Crow in the South, and I think it's set in Kansas. There's violence, there's colorism, there's all kinds of biblical ideas woven through the text. It is a great book, but one of those great books I'm pretty sure I don't really understand completely. The second book on the list is Our Celestial Bodies by Johka Alharthi. This is a book that is set in Oman, basically follows the stories of sisters to an Omani man who is relatively wealthy. It involves issues of slavery, about expectations for women, about marriage, about cheating. There are mystical elements of this. This won the International Booker Prize, at some point in the relatively recent past, and I really liked it. The next book on my list is The Death of Vivek OG by Akweke Emezi. I know other people would probably put Freshwater on this list or another one of Emezi's books, but The Death of Vivek OG really affected me on an emotional level. It is about a trans woman's acceptance and coming to realize that they are in fact trans and trying to live their life according to their truth in a hostile environment to any kind of trans people and homosexuality in Nigeria. And it's tragic and beautiful and moving, and I really liked it. Next book on my list is A Box of Matches by Nicholson Baker. Nicholson Baker is kind of, probably better known for some of the books he wrote, perhaps about sex. He kind of became obsessed with that. But before that, he wrote this book called A Box of Matches, which essentially follows a character named Emmett as he wakes up early every morning and lights a fire and sits around and contemplates life. It's a book about observations and then thoughts. It's a very quiet book, basically containing one man's ideas about random thoughts and observations of life. And it really, really spoke to me, this kind of ritualized nature of waking up in the morning and doing the same thing and thinking your thoughts. My mom, when she used to work, used to get up early, and she had what she called her collecting time to kind of be by herself and think her own thoughts and not have to worry about anything else going on in the day. I like that too, and this book really spoke to me for that reason. Plus, I think Baker is I think some of Baker's works deserve to be read, particularly this one. Nobody be surprised to see the next book on my list, which is Milkman by Anna Burns. This won the Booker Prize, about a young woman during the Troubles in Ireland who essentially tries to cut herself off emotionally, intellectually from family, boyfriend, etc. She walks around reading past, all these kind of bombing sites and sites of violence, but eventually even she can't stay immune from the violence going on in Northern Ireland. Really powerful, really cleverly told, really, I think, brilliantly structured book. The next book on my list is Disgrace by J.M. Coetzee. I say his name different every time I mention him. This, I think, is just a masterful work set at the end of apartheid in South Africa. with our main character, who is a college professor who is, you know, really despicable in all kinds of ways. I don't want to give away too much of that. Who loses his job as professor because of, you know, pursuing a sexual relationship with one of his students, which was unwelcome, perhaps being guilty of sexual coercion. You know, all these kind of things are left up in the air. Moves out with his daughter, who lives on a farm. She is the victim of a crime, and that really kind of forces him to rethink, relook at things. You know, a lot of things are left unclear here. A lot of things are left up to the reader to fill in, but I think it's a brilliant book. The next book on my list is Cantoras by Carolina de Robertis. This is a novel set in Uruguay among a group of lesbian women who have relationships with one another and friendships with one another, and they seek to go against the dictatorial and restrictive regimes of their time period. Their friendship leads them to essentially buy a house out on the beach in a remote area, which they go to kind of as a refuge, a place to be themselves, but real life and real events, including marriage and anti-gay legislation and the dictatorship in Uruguay at the time, intrude on their lives. I really thought this was moving and beautiful and, you know, in lots of ways also fun but poignant. Next on my list is A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan. This is really a series of 13 stories involving characters who are related to one another, in which it kind of explores the ideas of, I think, the randomness of relationships and moving forward in the future, and perhaps the hollowness of modern life as we move forward, the search for connections and relationships, the failure to make those oftentimes, deeply flawed characters, but also really entertaining stories which somewhat surround the music industry, which I thought was great. Next on my list is The Years by Annie Ernaux. This is the only Ernaux book I've read. Ernaux won the Nobel Prize, I believe, last year. And this is a book which essentially, as the name would indicate, is almost memoir-like in that it moves through the years of our main character's life, who I don't think we can help but associate with Erneaux, even though I saw recently Erneaux says she doesn't write about herself, and how, you know, that character deals with changes going on in France, in post-World War II France, political changes, social changes, changes in her personal life, marriage, kids, politics, all here. And I thought one of the real brilliant parts of the story is how it goes from kind of a repertorial description of things going on in the world that affect the character, and then a far more kind of, I think, beautiful, rich language describing the life of the main character. Next on my list, the top 25 in the last 25 years, is Louise Erdrich's Plague of Doves. This, I think, is Louise Erdrich's best book. It contains haunting images, just that right kind of blend, I think, of what it's tempting to call magical realism, but I think we might call indigenous cultural, spiritual beliefs, alongside crime committed on the reservation where many of Erdrich's stories and novels are set. This is a part, I believe, of the Justice trilogy that Erdrich wrote, and I think it's just great. Probably not surprised to see The Trees by Percival Everett on this list of the best 25 in the last 25 years. This is a satire about racism, Jim Crow, the South, you know, set in Money, Mississippi, the place where Emmett Till was murdered. Really violent descriptions of the murders of white men who are somehow connected to the Klan, to racism. It spins out from that into a discussion of the history, essentially, of lynching and racist violence, and then that is satirized through kind of the rest of the plot. It's really funny at times. It's really painful to read at times. I just thought it was brilliant. The next on my list is actually not one book, but three books, and again, no surprise here. This would be Jon Fosse's Septology, which contains 3 books as they were published in English. The Other Name, I Is Another, and A New Name. I just love these books. I love the way they're written. I love the way there's this repetitive, lyrical, kind of slow writing style in which details and plot points are kind of revealed slowly. And our main character has a doppelganger to show kind of how life might have gone differently, been worse, perhaps better. It's set, Fosse is a Norwegian author. It's set in Norway, and it is a brilliant, I think, exploration of love and grief and choices I just thought it was great. Next on my list is Minor Detail by Adania Shibli. This is a book set in the past and in more or less the present, dealing with Israel and its borders and violence Israeli violence against groups of people living in territory that they occupy. Two connected stories, one a really traumatic story involving sexual violence and an Israeli military officer, another involving a Palestinian woman who finds out about that incident and wants to research and travel to location. The stories are connected by violence, and I thought this was just brilliant, nice, really short book. Speaking of short books, the next book on my list is Foster by Clarke Keegan. I read Small Things Like These last year, and I thought it was great, and I read Foster this year, and I just thought it was so beautiful, that the writing was so beautiful. A simple, sad, poignant, powerful story told in absolutely crystalline prose, I thought. Just a great book. Next on my list is another book which makes frequent appearances on my list, and that's The Lost Children Archive by Valeria Luiselli. This book traces the journey of a kind of maid family, or a man and his daughter are married. A man marries a woman who has a child, he has a child, and they're going to go to the Texas borderland to kind of explore and do research on the Apache Indians and on what's going on along the border, and it kind of tells the story of children along the border, and it tells the story of the disintegration of this family, I think brilliantly. And the structure of the book is kind of contained in what kind of memories people have and how they store those memories, or what they think of as important, and really just a beautiful book. Next on the list is Piranesi by Suzzana Clarke. This won the Woman's Prize a few years ago, and it was a book that I had avoided reading for a long period of time, and a book I know that not everybody likes nearly as much as I did, but for me the book just clicked. The story of this person who is trapped in this mansion, this huge building which floods at night. He's lost kind of touch with the outside world, perhaps with reality. Is this a real world or not? Learned to survive, creating his own mythology, visited only every so often by an outsider who I believe refers to as the professor, and then we slowly begin to see the reality of the situation. I thought it was beautiful, and I thought the scenes and description of Piranesi's life in this house, this building, this mansion, whatever, really were just stuck to me. They're really images that were really powerful. I remember for a long time. Next on my list, again, probably not too surprising, is Austerlitz by W.G. Sebald. Story of a man's kind of, in some ways, search for his identity, who he is, and it's wrapped up in, the world of scholars and London and Austria and the Holocaust and one of the camps at which Jewish people were sent before being sent to Auschwitz. Just a really brilliant book, and it's a completely Sebaldian novel. I think probably his best novel, if not necessarily my favorite. Again, another book you won't be surprised to see here, if I can get it to show up, is Nupaming by Leanne Benasemasaki Simpson. This is a book basically which makes no concessions to non-Indigenous readers. And it tells the story in this kind of lyrical, beautiful, lots of white space page way, using words and concepts from Indigenous peoples of Canada to kind of tell the story about survival of Indigenous people in Canada, preservation of certain rituals, passing ideas on to young people. I thought just brilliant. I read it twice, 2 times in a row. Again, another frequent visitor here is Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward, a young woman growing up in incredible poverty in the South, facing the racism of a white community surrounding her, but also the violence, the confusion, the difficulty of her life as a hurricane bears down on their community. Just a brilliant book. Along the same lines, next on my list is The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. Kind of a magical realism look at slavery and racism in all its stages and phases over the course of American history, using this conceit that the Underground Railroad is actually a real train, which enslaved people can use to escape from slavery, but then it makes stops in all these places where we see the horrors of scientific experimentation on black people, as well as lynching and racist violence. Also a story about love and loss, just really great. Also, relatively recently, The Yield by Tara June Winch. This is a book which is incredibly well crafted, I thought, and oftentimes beautifully told. It involves two characters, a granddaughter and a grandson and a grandfather. The grandfather's chapters are more or less surround his creation, the desire to create a dictionary of indigenous Australian people's terms for things and words. And we get these definitions from his dictionary, and they're kind of interspersed with, or they alternate with, chapters of his granddaughter returning back to the place where he lived after his death to be a part of his funeral, and discovering along the way through talking to her relatives and by discovering her grandfather's dictionary, truth and reality about events in her own life and events in Australia's history. Probably knew there'd be a William Trevor novel here. It was a little bit difficult considering 1998 was the outside year, but I chose The Story of Lucy Galt. This is a really poignant, powerful, sad, as lots of William Trevor stories are, set in Ireland, in which a Protestant, a relatively wealthy Protestant family decides to leave Ireland to avoid sectarian violence, and somehow or another, and you kind of have to suspend disbelief just a little bit, they leave their daughter Lucy behind, and they believe her to be dead, drowned, they go off, they don't come back for decades. In the meantime, she is found, she grows up in the house she wanted to live, where she lived because she never wanted to leave, raised by servants, falls in love. There's reconciliation here, there's the inability to make up for lost time and hurts and things like that. Just a really beautiful book. Next to the last on my list is The Known World by Edward P. Jones, an incredibly complex and I think an incredibly important novel looking at the way in which slavery in the United States of America created this kind of closed system in which everybody lived within the confines of what the rules were, whether they were white or black, and involves the main character here is a black man who'd been freed from slavery, who goes on to own his own plantation and his own slaves, and what happens after his death, how that all falls apart. I think is a really brilliant look at, in a fictional wise way, at slavery in all kinds of ways and in all kinds of levels. There's a really brilliant description of the enslaved community on this plantation and their relationship with one another and their relationship with their owner, as well as what you would assume to be discussions of the relationship between white Southerners and enslaved people as well. And then the last book I have on my list is Let the Great World Spin by Colin McCann. I know McCann became controversial relatively recently, but this book is brilliant, and it is so incredibly complex in its plot that I'm not sure I could possibly do it justice. But in 1974, a tightrope walker set up a tightrope and walked between the two towers of the World Trade Center. This was written right around the time, or a little bit after 9/11. And that event kind of ties together other events in the story, other plot lines. One is an Irish man comes to New York City to see what's happened to, or figure out what's going on with his brother, a Jesuit priest who decided to live among the poor and prostitutes in the Bronx, and a woman whose son was killed in Vietnam and is dealing with that grief. As well as this family of tightrope walkers and others who all get pulled into this incredibly complex plot, which works itself out in a really beautiful, brilliant way. Okay, there you go. There is my list, the top 25 books of the last 25 years. Let me know what you think. I look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.